Mama, I found
Hello and welcome to Chats, a television podcast, Season 8, Part 2, RootsChatz. My name is Alan, and I'm joined by Magellan.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, good afternoon, my friend.
Good afternoon, it's good to see you.
I'm full of squids, if you cannot already tell. I'm made of squids.
We're both being ADR'd in like a 60s, like one of those grand adventure films.
Yeah.
Or something.
And we're the type of character that you like find on your journey, and you're like, those guys are weird.
Yeah, there is no sound equipment on set, so it's just some dude in the studio like, hello, good to see you.
It's like if you ever watch old movies and you see people in the background like digging, and they're not actually digging anything because you don't want to make sound. I love that. You can find compilations of that on the online, Magellan.
Oh, really? You can see them not hitting the ground?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
And you can hear them all saying clunk. Clunk,
clonk, clank.
Clunk.
No, because they ADR in shovel sounds later. They just need to not do it on set so that it doesn't go over the dialogue.
Yeah, but they say the clunks so that you know where the sounds are supposed to go.
The sounds go. Ooh, I should. Okay, I didn't pick up on that. Maybe.
Clunk, clunk. They whisper it to themselves. Clunk.
Well, I what was the other one? Like extras that are supposed to be talking like in a restaurant.
Yeah, they say peas and carrots.
Peas and carrots. I love it. I just want to be an extra so badly. I don't want to be a main character on anything.
There's a guy on my Facebook who, at first I thought it was a bit, but he is actually just has been an extra in a ton of things.
Whoa.
And so he'll like randomly post like, hey, this is the time that I was in the background of 30 Rock or whatever. Or like, this is me in the background of The Dark Knight, you know.
Yeah, it happens a lot with movies that take place in cities where they're like, well, we filmed in Vancouver, so everyone in Vancouver has a story about how they were in the background of some action movie.
Yeah.
This is, if you can't already tell, for whatever reason, Chat's a television podcast where I, Alan Ibrahim, and that Magellan Fluke talk about cult classic TV shows. And in some cases, just straight up classic TV shows.
Yeah, right.
No cult here, folks. We're talking this season on Chats about the 1977 miniseries Roots.
We're continuing our summer of miniseries, Summer School, taking you to summer school.
Chats, summer school, and it's on a blackboard with like chalk font.
Yeah, oh man. If we had that level of production value, that would be something else. So we're going to be covering 1977's Roots. We piloted Roots over on our Patreon last week. So if you're a patron, you haven't listened to that, you can go over and listen to that discussion. We'll be watching at least the 1977 series for the next 3 episodes. And then there was a sequel series and a remake, and we're still trying to figure out if we're going to cover those or not. But that's what we're going to be doing for the next few weeks.
Wow. I'm excited. What's your history with Roots, Mr. Magellan, before even the pilot chats that we did?
So I have never seen it. I've definitely heard the name Roots many times. And I've definitely heard Kunta Kinte's name referenced in pop culture. So I think probably the 2 major things from which I heard about Roots
Kendrick
were...
Lamar.
One, Kendrick Lamar, yes. And can you get the other one?
Nope, I cannot.
It's LeVar Burton being on Community.
Oh, and he references the character?
Yeah, he references it. I'm rewatching Community, so I just saw this one. And there's an episode where, this is stupid that I'm describing this, but there's an episode where Troy meets LeVar Burton and he can't
freaks
speak
out
because he loves him so much.
Mm-hmm.
And Britta says something about like, can you imagine making Kunta Kinte mad at you or something like that? And then in the final scene, LeVar Burton is like eating a delicious meal with Troy and trying to get him to talk and be like, oh, you want this, you want that? And then Troy runs out screaming because he's had too much. And then LeVar Burton reaches across the table with his fork and he's like, more food for Kunta.
That's really great that he has a sense of humor.
Yeah. So I know about it from knowing who LeVar Burton is and from it being referenced a number of different places, but I've never seen it itself. What about you?
Yeah, I had also never seen it, and I have the exact same sort of background as you there, but I was thinking, because this is actually, for a lot of younger folks, Roots was in their like school curriculum.
Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't like have it shown to us in high school or something like that.
Well, I think part of it is we're a little young for the era where people were showing this, just like by a couple years, and they kind of moved on to a different curriculum. They didn't talk about slavery as much as I would have liked in our high school curriculum. And we're obviously going to be talking about that for pretty much the entirety of this podcast. But you know, our high school, both that Majal and I both went to, we've been friends since middle school. Our high school was vastly predominantly white. I saw a statistic recently that was like putting it in the high 70-something%.
The town is in the 90s, I think.
The town overall, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. The high school, yeah, I don't remember exactly.
And actually, like lately, like literally in the last couple of weeks, people in our high school and alumni of our high school have been trying to make bigger efforts to like get rid of the racist mascot and like actually listen to people of color who go to school there and feel like they're or are being bullied horribly all the time.
Right.
So you know, it's nice to finally see a little bit of progress there. But yeah, we definitely were not shown Roots, or even honestly that many stories. Like I remember the one like high school slavery story that I remember watching in high school for sure was Mississippi Burning, which is a kind of like a weird, not great film with Whoopi Goldberg and Alec Baldwin, where it's like in, you know, I think in the early 20th century, a black man is killed, and then the guy who kills him is acquitted, and then in the present, he's put back on trial because they're like, oh my God, that was actually so racist. We should put this guy on trial, but he gets away with it because of a racist judge. It's a whole thing. Kind of interesting story, but it's also very much in the like the you know, heroic white people sort of story. Yeah. Which brings us to Roots.
I just looked up the demographics of our hometown, by the way.
Yeah.
And as of the 2000 census,
yep.
The town that we grew up in was 93.96% white.
Oh!
So, yeah.
I thought they said that New England was like all really liberal and we're like really open-minded and stuff.
Well, yeah.
That's where we're coming from, and so as always, we want to make sure that people are very aware of where we're coming from in terms of our background, our privilege, and all of that. I'm a white passing Arab person, and Majan's a white guy. Like, we know that we are not the voices you want to hear to talk about the black experience and slavery. Majan is a history teacher, though, and we have an eye for not only history and acknowledging the parts of American history that aren't talked about in school, and also talking about television that is important to the history of television. So
yeah, so that's kind of how we're going to try to come at it with a certain level of humility and like we just said, an acknowledgement of we're not the people to talk about this.
Yeah.
With also just we're watching it because it's really important to the history of television, and we've been curious about it for a while, so that's what we're doing.
Yeah, what better way to celebrate America's history than to talk about slavery in a sometimes honest, sometimes kind of clean way. But I think we'll get into that as we talk about the first two episodes of Roots. So Roots is based on a book by Alex Haley, which blew up in the 1970s. Very successful novel about the legacy of the family history of a slave named Kunta Kinte, who was brought from the Gambia to Annapolis, Maryland, in the 1770s. And his children, his wife, his family, and the legacy that leads all the way to the writer of the Roots novel, Alex Haley himself. There's a lot of talk in the discussion around Roots about the validity of Haley's story and how much of it was based in fact and how much of it was sort of played up for drama and sort of narrative cleanness. But in terms of the television series, it was broadcast as 8 90-minute episodes. There's like different ways that this was cut, though. I don't know if you're able to speak, how much you're able to speak to that, Magellan. Just like the release of Roots.
Just to tell people what we're watching and in what order. You mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, Roots was initially released in 8 parts on consecutive nights. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then we are going by the sort of like DVD re-edited or, home video re-edited release sections. So that edits it into 6 90-minute parts instead of 8 parts. So today it's the same either way. Parts 1 and 2 are 90 minutes in both the original run and the re-edited version. Then next week we'll be watching part 3, which is 3 and 4 put together. Then part 4, which is 5 and half of 6 put together. Then part 5, which is half of 6 and 7 put together. And then part 6, which is the original part 8. And we'll make sure that we talk about that as we get closer to actually watching those things.
Heck yeah. I looked it up, actually. This was all aired, like you said, one a night on ABC. So network television was airing Roots in the 70s. Important to note also the sort of context at the time of its release, where the America is still relatively close to sort of the major legislations of the civil rights movement. And it seems like America at the time is sort of being a little bit more critical of its own history and of its story and realizing how much of the backbone of American industry and culture in general is on the back of imprisoned Black folk from Africa. So, Roots is coming at it like that, like, hey, this is something we need to talk about. And I feel like overall, watching these episodes, I get this sense that you're getting a story that is both very, like, it's confronting you with hard truths, but also, like, serving it to you in kind of a slightly more pleasant way than it probably was in reality.
Yes.
And how much of that is based on, adapting Haley's novel, and how much of that is adapting, then bringing that into television, is difficult for us to say here. But I can definitely say that, like, this feels a little bit nice. So we watched the first 2 90-minute parts, and I would say amongst the two, the second one is the more, like, pleasant in that way. It kind of, like, becomes a story instead of, like, you're not just, like, witnessing raw tragedy like you are in most of the first one. But I think we should get into it if you're ready, Magellan.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the credits on these are a little weird, but both the first part has credits William Blinn as the person who wrote it for TV, but the whole series is written by William Blinn and Ernest Kinoy, and this first one is directed by David Green. And we started airing Roots on January 23rd, 1977. So Magellan, can you tell me what happens in part 1 of Roots?
Sure thing. In this episode, in 1750 in Gambia, West Africa, Kunta Kinte, son of Amoro and Binta, distinguishes himself among his tribesmen in manhood training rituals. But he does not enjoy his new status long. Slave traders sweeping the countryside seize him. Chained with other captives, Kunta begins an agonized odyssey to the new world.
Blam.
Yeah. So, Alan, what do you think of part 1 overall?
I enjoyed it. I thought that the parallel structure of this one was the most frustrating and the most, like, we're trying to appeal to a lot of the white audience watching this. I think that's where a lot of my negativity for it comes from. But all of the stuff in the Gambia is, like, really, I think, richly portrayed, and however accurate it is to history, again, I'm not sure, but the characters are well conceived and very well acted. You understand immediately that this is a story not just about Kunta Kinte, but about the family and about the legacy, which I think is important when talking about intergenerational trauma, is that it doesn't start with a person making a mistake or of a society making a mistake, but, like, generations of people being imprisoned, making mistakes, or doing whatever, depending on what side of the story you're talking about. But yeah, it's really impressive to watch a 20-year-old, I believe, LeVar Burton, bring, like, the growing up story to as a like childhood upended by
Yeah.
imperialism, by colonialism. That stuff's all really, it's really well performed, like I said.
Yeah, he's fantastic in it.
What about you? What'd you think?
Yeah, I generally agree with what you said, that there are certainly frustrating things about just like making this presentable to a 70s white audience, that those things feel obvious, and we can talk about those in particular, but that overall the depiction of Kunta Kinte and his family feels really nuanced and respectful of like their humanity and the ways in which they are real complicated people. And you know, it does show a certain degree of horror. We see to a certain extent what the Middle Passage looks like, which is not something that, I don't know that it had ever been depicted on television prior to this point. If it had, certainly it had happened sparingly. And so I think there's a lot to be said for like this in the context of the 70s, when, and I was reading a little bit about this, but there's like some new historical scholarship that's going on in the 60s and 70s because of the civil rights movement around like, let's actually learn what the lives of enslaved people were like. And so in a way, Roots is kind of, even though it's, you know, the credibility of it as a literal historical account is suspect, and Kunta Kinte probably didn't actually exist, still the things that it's showing us are on the cutting edge of American historiography, just around like thinking about and envisioning what this world was like, what the world of an enslaved person was like. And so for those reasons, I had a lot of respect for what they were trying to do here. And it's marred by some unfortunate things. But overall, I thought it was really engaging. This is actually, I've now watched it 3 times.
Damn.
Because I pre-watched it for us to be like, should we pilot this? Then I watched it when we piloted it, and then I watched it this time. And there's stuff to discover and think about every time. So it's a pretty rich text, I will say.
Yeah, usually when we do shows that we started out on Pilot Chats and then I'm rewatching for the pod, by my second viewing, because this is my second viewing, I'm looking more for like the craft of the series instead of just the raw plot of it. And that's pretty easy with this one because, like you said, it's a very well done show, very complex. There's a lot to look at and a lot to think about beyond just the core essential nature of the story being told.
Yeah.
Because it ends up being, in terms of a summary, as simple as what you said at the top, which is Kunta Kinte is going through a manhood ritual. We learn about his culture and his family, and then him and several other members of his community are captured by slavers and brought to the New World, which is the Americas, and Annapolis, Maryland, which we end up seeing in the second one. And it seems like at the end of this first one, like the Mandinka wrestler, who's a pillar of Kunta Kinte's community, is kind of encouraging him and the rest of the men in the slave ship to rise up and take over the ship. So, you know, it ends up being that simple, but there's a lot on the way there that I think works really well.
Yeah.
I think this episode also gets a bit more of like a pass, I guess, for me than the second one, because we actually get to see the Gambian culture here and like really zoom in on that, completely separate from its relationship to slavery before the men come in.
Right.
So that's like some of the stuff that I enjoy the most, and that's why I think I like this one more than the second one, because it's not just like, you know, a man inside of a horrible system. It's like, no, this is what happens when you don't interfere. Is we have an advanced culture of wonderful people who are working hard and instilling values into their youth and trying to be upstanding members of a like progressive society.
Yeah, and you understand what's at stake for Kunta and what has been taken from him by seeing what his society looked like.
Because he's only 17 at the time of this story, by 1777, I think. But the episode actually starts with him, his birth, which again, this not being a story about him, but about the family, watching his dad be outside of the hut, and he's like, I'm not gonna, I don't, they don't like, the man is not supposed to be inside during the birth of this child. This is the first example of what I consider to be the show's somewhat weird stunt casting, because not the father, but I believe it's the woman inside of the house with Kunta Kinte's mom is played by Maya Angelou.
Yeah, it's his grandmother.
Yeah. Which is like, it's the 70s and you're trying to get a lot of people to watch the show. Who better to bring than...
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can talk contextually about some of those production things that feel strange. So one of them is like the stunt casting there, which is more egregious with, I think, the white actors, but it's still really, really weird when he like meets O.J. Simpson later.
Ugh.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
And especially on the third viewing, I was like, this character doesn't need to exist.
He's only there for him to then through that meet Fanta, but
right. But you could have written it a different way.
Yeah, the 5-minute chase scene is just like, all right, you guys, famous.
It's just so you can say in the opening credits, like, hey, check it out, Ed Asner, O.J. Simpson.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of that going on because it's sort of like, hey, watch the show. Look at the famous people we've got in it. Right. And then the other thing is Roots was aired on consecutive nights, which was like revolutionary. Oh my gosh, this is a whole new way to do TV miniseries, that you can make it this sort of event every night you tune in to the next part. But the reason that they did that was because they were worried that nobody was going to watch it. Nobody would want to watch a story about black characters.
Yeah.
And so, like, let's just get it out the door as quickly as we can.
Right. A lot of the things that made Roots important both worked in its favor and also came out as a result of, like, misconceptions and unfortunate understandings about the world.
And racism, yeah.
And racism, exactly.
And they were wrong. The producers of the show were dead wrong, because Roots remains one of the highest rated shows ever. I found a list on businessinsider.com of the 20 most watched TV episodes of all time.
Oh, sure.
And all 8 parts of Roots are in the top 20.
Whoa.
And the final installment of Roots is the like 5th highest rated or the 5th most watched, I should say, episode of TV ever.
When was that list updated? Does it say, like, when it was published?
This list is from 2017.
Wow. What's number 1, by the way? Just for my own edification.
So I can give you the top 5.
Okay.
And this, by the way, is TV shows. There's another list on Wikipedia that's like the most watched television broadcasts ever.
Right. Because Gone with the Wind would be up there then once you just do broadcasts.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. But the thing that fills out the list more so in broadcast is like the Super Bowl.
Oh wow! Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But still, even when you do the top 100 of all things broadcast ever, all 8 parts of Roots are still in the top 100, even with like every Super Bowl in there.
Wow.
Yeah. So number 1 most watched TV episode ever was the finale of MASH.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious to me that MASH was that popular. Yeah. The second is the finale of Cheers.
Sure. Yeah, that lines up.
The third is the Who Shot JR Dallas episode.
Yeah.
The resolution of that. And then the fourth is the finale of Seinfeld.
Wow.
And then number 5 is the finale of Roots.
Interesting picks there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that says about America exactly in the 70s and
yeah,
60s,
I mean,
it
just says that America likes
stories about white people
a lot,
and sitcoms.
Right. Yeah, and it likes to say goodbye to sitcoms.
Right.
I suppose. But yeah, so there's some production weirdness and unfortunate, casting and timing with the series. Maya Angelou was great in it. I really liked. This is something we didn't talk about in our pilot, but the role of the women in this episode I found really fascinating and kind of sad.
Yeah.
Because just to jump ahead a little bit, since we're talking about her character,
Because she's here, and then her other major scene is towards the middle.
Towards the middle of the episode, yeah. Because there's this whole thread about how Kunta's mom, Binta, she's like, oh, you're going to go be a man. You're going to go to manhood training or whatever. You've been a good boy. And she says it in kind of this like sad way, like you've been a good boy. And then they take him away to manhood training. And she looks really upset about it. And in the moment, you're kind of like, well, what's she upset about? He's just going to go through this ritual, right? And then when he comes back, and this, I appreciate this about the series, that they're showing both moments of like celebration and trying to really honestly depict this culture and the wisdom of the people within it, like the wrestler character that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But also there's kind of a darkness, as there is in all cultures, where when Kunta comes back, his mom is like, oh my God, you're back. This is so great. Your dad made you a new tent. Now where you were sleeping, I can make a little sewing table for myself, or whatever she says. And Kunta Kinte is like giving her nothing. And then she's like, you should thank your father. And he says a woman shouldn't tell a man what to do.
Right. Yep. He discovered sexism.
Right. And so you can see in that moment why she was so upset when he was going to manhood training, because it's like, I'm about to lose my son and like the relationship that I have with him, because now he's going to be like, I'm a man and I'm above you now, in a very immature understanding of what manhood is, on Kunta Kinte's part. But then when he goes to his hut, he's so happy about it. He's like, hell yeah, I got my own hut. And then Maya Angelou comes in and she's like, hey, listen up, jerk.
Smacks him in the head a couple times.
Let me knock some sense into you. Which is a really fun scene. She's like, no matter if you're a man or not, I'm still going to be your grandmother. And remember that like God is still better than you.
Yeah.
Even if you don't think so. So I thought
go make a drum for your damn brother, you loser.
You jerk. Yeah. So I thought that scene was really fun.
Yeah, she's wonderful, and brings that like familial warmth that is so essential. And like you were saying, it's not all happiness and fun and games and like cute like little family moments in the time before the slavers come. There is plenty of like the difficulty of manhood and the arrogance that Kunta Kinte shows to his community members and his seniors, that is kind of both physically and mentally like hit out of him a little bit, because he speaks to the wrestler and talks about how, and they have that wonderful conversation a little bit later where he's saying that the wrestler asks him, what animal do you want to be the most like, basically. And he's talking about like, do you want to be? Is it the wolf and the boar, or what is? I
thought it was a panther and a warthog.
The panther, yeah. And he says, I want to be the best one. And he's like, well,
that's not an answer.
Let's just say there isn't a best one. Can you just pick an answer, please? And he's like, well, then I'd be the boar, because he fights and he's going always forward. And he's like, yes, that's true. You make a good point. The boar also is the one that we hunt easily and kill and eat. So you don't want to be the boar. Don't run into danger. You run away from danger. You never run into danger, which is important later. This also comes back when he talks about the she-goat that his family owns and how it's pregnant and it might have twins, and he's excited that he's going to help raise it and and succeed with that stuff. And then he watches the she-goat get attacked by an animal and attempts to chase the animal and hit it with rocks. And later somebody's like, so you tried to fight, right? And he's like, yeah. He's like, what tools you got? You got your slingshot? He's like, yeah, I used my slingshot. He's like, nice. Great. How'd that go for you? Did you get the goat? He's like, no, I didn't get the goat. Because you're not going to kill an animal with a slingshot. Come on.
Right. Yeah, this is something we talked about in the pilot, but I think my favorite idea coming out of this first episode is this reflection on like, what does it mean to be a man, or more broadly, what does it mean to be brave and to fight, and to be a warrior, because that's what he's being raised to be, is a warrior. But he's about to go into unspeakably cruel conditions and face vicious animals like the cheetah in the form of the white men that attempt to oppress and harm and subjugate him. And so even though this episode is, not directly right away dealing with that, with Kunta Kinte in that situation in bondage, it's still sorting through what are the things that he's going to have to learn in the process of that. Like if you just charge, you're going to get killed. And it's a really, really hard truth to accept. But slavery is not the way that Kanye West described it as a choice. It's not as easy as saying like, well, you could just fight back, because there's just so much nuance in being held in bondage and by someone who would kill you at the drop of a hat if you oppose them. And so what does bravery look like in a situation like that when you're literally facing down a carnivorous animal?
Right, exactly. And he's trying to learn that, and we continue to follow along with his manhood ceremony and his relationship to the other young boys in his village. And there's a lot of like friendliness and love between them. I love that scene after he talks to the wrestler, and he's like telling the guys, they're like, "Oh, what did you talk about?" And he's like, "Oh, we were just talking about wrestling." And he like lies with the boys, and then they all like wait, and then they tickle him.
Tickling him. That was really sweet.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you have to. The show has to make great strides to show you that these are people that we can love and enjoy and appreciate, and watch them be flawed, but also caring before that is all ripped from them. And the way that's ripped from them, I mean, like it's not as clean as the story I feel like we're taught, where he's assigned, Kunta Kinte is assigned to chase a bird using only his hands and capture the bird, and it's sort of a sprinting bird, not a flying bird. And this is the moment where we run into I have his character's name here, but O.J. Simpson's character.
Mm-hmm.
Let me find it so that I can be correct for this one time. Kadi Toure. He's chasing the bird, and he tackles Kadi Toure's wife and knocks her to the ground. And then she's like, "You asshole!" He's like, "No, but I have an assignment." And then you get this like again very like, because for people who don't know, like at the time no one was talking about O.J. Simpson as a murderer. They were talking about him as like a famous actor and football player.
Yeah.
So you just get to watch him like be a linebacker basically and like run and tackle
right.
Kunta Kinte. And he's like, "Yeah, you have an assignment. You also have my daughter who you just like attacked, and my wife, and like we have food and stuff that you knocked over. You're gonna fix it." And he's like, "Okay, I guess I will." It's in that moment that he meets Fanta, who comes back later, and they kind of like have a small moment. But then while he's chasing the bird, he sees his first white man, who's one of the men that we see as part of the Mr. Davies plot, who's now here to round up him and a bunch of his village. And it's important too that like they don't just show like white men as the people capturing slaves. They also are hiring other African men to capture slaves. So Kunta Kinte is actually betrayed and thinks that he sees that he's being chased and immediately knows to run, even though these are other African men. And he's bound and chained up.
Yeah, well, and I think it's something important to consider is just like we have a certain race consciousness now that I wonder if those men would have had that same race consciousness as we do. Like the men who capture Kunta Kinte. Mm-hmm. I don't know that they would have necessarily thought of what they were doing as a betrayal if they think of him as like he's from a different tribe than us or something like that.
True.
Like they wouldn't necessarily have an idea of like black solidarity in the face of whiteness, because to them it's like, well, he's from over there. He's not one of us. We're trying to, either get money from these white slave traders, or it's an extortion thing or something.
Protect our own lives.
Right. So
yeah, they talk about that stuff later when they're in the ship, and the wrestler is like, there are other people here of different cultures. Like, Africa is not a whole. It's not one.
It's not monolithic. Yeah.
Exactly. Which again is so important to remind people of. That there is always going to be an other. There's always going to be a person that you see as beneath you or different than you, and that's the first. That moment on the ship is the first like real good solidarity moment after the everyone is taken in.
Yeah,
them being
for the
like,
wrestler guys, like now that we're chained together, it doesn't matter
where we're from.
These former distinctions we had, because now we're one village, which is a cool moment.
Yeah, and it again goes against the myth that. These slaves like understood the English being spoken to them, or that they were like lying, or that they were choosing to be enslaved, as Kanye West said. It's they barely understood each other, and then they're being taken to a community surrounded by other enslaved African people who they don't understand, and white men attacking them all and saying, you all are one person that works for us and needs to speak our language.
Right.
There's several layers of horrible going on there, even in just the language of it.
Yeah. Another thing that complicates other Africans being the people that capture Kunta Kinte is, I hear sometimes people talk about like, but there was slavery in Africa.
Yeah.
And
hit him with that, Magellan.
Well, it's really important to distinguish different kinds of slavery here, because the slavery that existed in parts of Africa was people enslaving other warriors that they defeat in battle.
Yeah.
Or enslaving, people from a village or something that they conquer, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Slavery in those cases, as was the case of like the Roman Empire or something, it's slavery as a condition of victory, as opposed to what's developing in the Americas. Because of European colonization, which was chattel slavery, which is slavery as a condition of birth, tied to race. So I don't know that they necessarily had, maybe they did know entirely what they were doing, but maybe they had a sense of the slavery that they were selling Kunta Kinte into, or, trading him into, or whatever you want to call it, as a slavery that they understood of like, we are defeating a rival warrior, and so he's going to be brought into slavery as a result of losing this battle. Yeah, not necessarily knowing that like we are essentially putting him as well as generations of his descendants into a system by which, when you are born black, you're born enslaved.
Exactly.
And those things they're different, and it's a nuance that I think people don't always recognize or appreciate.
It's a conversation they end up having, some of the white folks have in the second episode, but with there not being a concept of like, you're born white, you're enslaved, at least in America there isn't that concept. They're culpable in a different way for coming in and saying like, these people belong to us because we have more powerful weaponry, and they are better as slaves than they are as free people. Like, that's the role. It's the sort of like the justification of this is what they're supposed to do. We're just doing the way it's supposed to be. Because at this point,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, how long has slavery been a popular thing of humans in by this point in the series?
Well, in terms of the scope of human history, I mean, there have been forms of slavery.
I mean, in the Americas.
If we're talking about chattel slavery in the Americas, this is 1765 or 67 at the point that Kunta Kinte is captured. Mm-hmm. So that, I mean, it's been popularized by the 1619 Project, so people probably know that the first enslaved Africans were brought to the coast of the Americas in 1619. But there had been, so we're like over a century past that point at this point, when we're seeing this in Roots. But I mean, the slave trade conducted by the Portuguese goes back to like the 1500s. So, and
Right.
those ideas about racial difference has certainly evolved over a long period of time. But by the time we're in the 1700s, it is like a pretty well established institution, and there are now like, again, well established colonies, because we're at this point in 67, we're less than a decade out from the Declaration of Independence,
Right.
in 1776.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a thriving trade at this point,
And
kind of
yeah.
casts some. It certainly casts the Ed Asner character in an odd light, because
exactly.
he like is this well-known ship captain trading guy who has somehow never captained a ship with enslaved people as cargo before, which could be possible, but he expresses such bewilderment, especially in the second episode, at like, wait a minute, I'm gonna have to do the whole triangle trade again, which is like, what are you this has been a thing your whole life.
Where have you been? Like, you think
From
about
the
things that have
moment
been
you've
around
been
for a
born.
century, and you
Yeah.
can't. There's like nothing that's been around for a century that I can safely be like, yeah, I had no idea. Like, what? No, what?
Right.
Fundamental institutions of my parts of my industry that I'm just completely blind to requires both a privilege and a like complete ignorance that I struggle to believe that he can have.
Such a deep naivete that he thought he would never come across this.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway,
I do want to talk about his character before we start getting into the second one, but like
sure.
the other stuff with the community that's important is like none of these people in this first episode have been enslaved before, at least by
True.
Americans. Like we're to understand that this is their first time being taken across. But the senior members of the community have absolutely seen this before, because they have this like in-depth description and meeting with the young men of like what Kunta Kinte saw is what's called a white man. They smell like wet chickens, which is important because he's like, they're going to look different, and you're just going to get a sense that they're different, and that's going to scare you, and they're going to hurt you. Kind of describing them as you would describe, like you're talking about like the carnivorous animal. Which is important because he's saying that you need to like be aware of yourself, work with other people, don't ever be alone, and at some point it's likely that they're just going to take you, and we're gonna have to deal with that. So they've experienced it before, they know this has happened before, and they've lived through it. Before they're taken, though, the young men, as I'm to understand it, go through another part of the manhood ceremony, which seems to be a circumcision of sorts.
Yep. So that appears to be what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I was unclear the first time, but they talk about like we put the paste on your manhood, or they have a term for it, but
Fateau is what they call it.
fateau, yeah, which will numb it, and then they're going to cut it, and they like show the cutting tool, but then they don't show the act, which I think is slightly tactful. Just like, yeah, we don't need to get into that, but we know that happens.
It was an interesting touch. I guess that must be a real ceremony for them to use it and show it. It certainly, every time it happened, I was like, ooh, no, ow.
I mean, circumcision is a very popular and common practice globally, both for religious reasons and for cultural reasons.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. I guess we don't have to get into it, but I think it's gruesome in all instances. But something about it being on grown men feels especially bad. But maybe it's worse on babies, actually. Who knows?
That's a very popular discussion, actually. It's like, do you wait till they're old enough to know what it is, or do it before they know what it is? What do you choose? But anyways, yeah, he's searching for drum parts for his younger brother on the recommendation of his grandmother, and then a bunch of African men working for Mr. Gardner throw him in chains in the beach, and then we get all the horrible, sad stuff in the beach, and then we kind of focus more then on Gardner and Mr. Davies talking about like the different ways to pack slaves, which is awful, but also very important because it reminds us that they're talking about them as property and as things you put on a manifest, and obviously not as people, because, oh God.
Yeah.
There's no way to talk about that. I made a note in my second viewing that it's kind of interesting how Gardner, the character who actually does the capturing or helps do the capturing, is like separate from the people transporting, because I mean they're hiring him to do that. They're paying him and saying, you know, how many people can you get?
Yeah.
And he says, I'll get as many as I can. So his job is just to do that. And
just to wait on the coast for European ships to show up to do that.
That's how we understand it. So like they don't have to do the capturing, which obviously is intended to like distance them from it and not have them dirty their hands and not put their lives in any sort of risk. And they barely ever even have to look at their fucking slaves. They can just tell someone to do it, then they're put on the ship and they're like, you put enough people on the ship, and they say yes, and then we leave. It's really intense. And then we get that that really heartbreaking shot of Ormoro, Kunta Kinte's father, walking across the beach. It's like a gorgeous shot where it's him and a bunch of the other men like walking along with like their weaponry, and he finds Kunta Kinte's bag and like goes to the ground and screams. And that part is so intense.
Yeah. He's never going to see his son again.
Yeah, just has to accept that, you know. He went through a manhood ceremony. We were prepared to say goodbye to him for that, and now we're saying goodbye to him for a different, much more horrible reason. Mm-hmm. So the show then shifts to the ship, which is, what is it called? It's called like the
Lord Ligonier.
The Lord Ligonier, the LL. And we start talking more about Mr. Davies, who's kind of getting scenes parallel to this stuff. But basically,
I think we can talk about Davies as a character, the Ed Asner character.
Yes, the classic, I work enslaving, but I think this is a bad idea, you guys.
Yeah, I was watching an interview with Ed Asner about it, and he said that the character was sort of like the good German character.
Right.
Of like this person who claims that they were totally, they abhorred what was going on, but they were a part of it. They supported it. They were party to it.
Completely.
And yeah, he's just more and more infuriating every time you watch this, I feel like, because he really convinces himself that he's doing the good thing. He says at the beginning to his second in command, Slater, like, we'll set sail on the Sabbath because that's the Christian thing to do. And then later, when Slater proposes, like, oh, I'll bring a woman to your cabin, or no, he's just talking
belly
about
warmer.
Like, yeah, and he says, like, oh, not on my ship. I will not lead any men into sin. And to him, the
sin
only
is
sin,
sex.
Yeah, fornication is the only real sin here. But obviously, that's not the case. And he's sort of allowing himself to do certain evil things. But like, oh, but it could be worse. And I didn't notice this before, but there's a conversation that he has with Slater where Slater's basically explaining, Slater is like the most outwardly racist character that we see in this first episode.
Right, his whole livelihood has succeeded because of the slave trade. This is the reason he can be successful. He's happy to do it.
Right. And obviously Davies is as racist as he is, but is more subdued about it. But they have this conversation where Slater's like, well, you see, these people are genetically predisposed. He wouldn't have said genetically, but like they're born to be enslaved. They're just suited for it. And he's like, the way that you're suited to be captain. And Captain Davies is kind of like, oh, I guess I could see that. So he's willing to be like, well, yeah, there's a hierarchy of races. Sure, totally. And then Slater's like, and it's better for them. And Davies is like, well, that's not true.
Yeah.
But he is totally okay with parts of it, with parts of the racist thinking.
But not the thumb screws. Anything but the thumb screws.
Right. Outright obvious cruelty and violence he's against. But taking people from their homeland, bringing them into forced servitude, and thinking of them as lesser beings than yourself, he's totally cool with that stuff. That stuff's fine to him. Just don't be like violent about it.
And there's no sex, and I don't want to see any of this. The thing I didn't catch in the first viewing is when they take all of the slaves to the top deck to dance, to move their legs and to like stretch. He's like looking away, and Slater's like, "Don't you want to see your property?" And he's like, "Shut up! Don't make me look at them," because the idea that he has to acknowledge them and look them in the eye, which he eventually does, because he's like yelling at Slater, kind of hits him of like, "Oh yeah, those are people. Those are people that exist and have interiority in lives," and again takes this sort of like superiority over Slater later, where the men are all chanting a phrase that they don't the white men don't understand, and he's like, "Do you know what they're saying, Slater?" And Slater's like, "I would never, like, I can't say that I understand their language," and he's like, "I don't understand a word of it either, but I know exactly what they're saying, and they're telling us to sleep lightly, Mr. Slater." So he's like, we better watch out because they're gonna revolt. Like, he's just like, he knows, but he's like, I'm not gonna do anything about it. It's like, get guns, and then when he does worry about it later, he's like, "Can you guys have guns, and there's more of you, right?" This is like, I think in episode 2 when the revolt actually happens, but it's just like, we're not gonna lose, obviously, so don't worry about it. They're just property. It's so abhorrent, and the way that Davies again tries to distance himself from these people and these families is so like, we want to look away from it, but we have to look at it. I think that's sort of like the big value of watching Roots is like, yeah, sometimes these stories they're not nice. They're not like friendly and palatable.
Right. Yeah. And I think the thing to take from the Ed Asner character is like, at least the way it was originally conceived, it seems that the character was added to give white audience members some level of comfort in like, hey, there were good white people involved. But the thing to take from this is like, a huge part of the problem with systemic oppression and racism is the people who think that they're good people who go along with it.
Right. I'm just a good Christian man doing a good Christian job.
Yeah. Like Martin Luther King said that the perhaps more dangerous to the cause of equality than like outright segregationist racists were white moderates who were like, well, yeah, you can get equality, but don't do it that way. I mean, that's
so
not the right way to
violent.
do
Stop.
it. And that's essentially what the Ed Asner character represents is the sort of white moderate, like, well, you know, this is bad, and like we shouldn't do certain things that certain way, but we can't let them go. And they're a lesser race than us. Yeah.
And I also thought it was kind of interesting how they make this point to differentiate Davies from like Slater and the rest of the men, because he taught, like, Slater comes up to him and says, like, you know, keep your prayer to yourself, or keep it for Sunday service, or keep it for, you know, not just like your day to day, because the rest of us don't do stuff like that. And it kind of suggests that like that godliness is what keeps Davies sort of like protected and what keeps his character like in moral good standing. It's like, well, as long as it almost like is saying that get straying from Christianity is what leads to things like this happening. But I don't think they lean hard enough into that to make it a point. I just think that that's like something I analyzed in looking at Slater versus.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because you could say that they're saying like, if you followed Christian values, you wouldn't do these things. But you could also say that they're sort of saying like, he's using Christianity as a way to pretend that he's not doing anything bad.
And they're just being honest about it.
Yeah. Because Slater invokes Christianity as well a couple times. He says, like, we're bringing them to a Christian land. And then the part, it's so gross, the part where Davies tells Slater to clean them, he's like, oh, I get it. Cleanliness is next to godliness.
Right.
It's so, oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah, again, Roots got a lot of credit for this at the time, but I continue to respect its like willingness to just say those things.
Yeah.
And to like, you know, it's the 70s, so the connotation is slightly different, but the fact that all of them use the N-word when describing the slaves feels like a smart choice to, like, again, not shy away from that and be like, they are saying it, they say it comfortably, they throw it amongst a bunch of other slurs. There's nothing weird about that yet. So yeah, it's basically, we get from there to him writing, Davy's writing a letter to his wife. He's got these like heavy bags under his eyes, and he says, "You'll never, I deeply regret taking this journey, in part because I don't get to see you and our child, but also because ... It's like, just get to the point. And the last thing with him is that Slater brings an African slave to him and says, like, "Hey, she's yours for the night. She's your bed warmer or whatever. Use her however you want. I'm not gonna. I'll close the door and look away. And it's between you and God, I guess." And he tries to. It's so gross. He tries to, like, introduce himself to her. He says, "My name is Thomas. That's my Christian name. Well, now what should I call you?" And it's like, there are so many instances in this and the second episode of people, like, speaking English to slaves and then going, "Oh, that's my bad. I forgot. You don't understand the words I'm saying to you. I'm just talking to the audience." It's just like, he should know. He should know. And he doesn't. We don't see what he does with her. It's implied that he does not do anything. But and then Kunta Kinte describes a dream that he had where he saw a giant white bird swallow him up and take him away from his home. And he said he woke up and he was still inside the belly of that bird, which is powerful. And yeah, we kind of, like, hint that the revolt is going to happen next time. So in episode 2, we see the results of said revolt. Do you have any stray notes about this first one while we're here?
The only thing I have that I can't remember if we talked about it when we piloted this or not, but I just really love and am heartbroken still by the exchange of lines between Kunta Kinte's mother and father at the very beginning, where his father says being born is hard work, and then his mom says, "We will give him a very good life," and the dad says, "We have given him life, Binta. Good or not good, this is for Allah to say."
Right.
Yeah, which is just, like, so heartbreaking.
Beyond being born, it's not up to us whether or not his life goes well, because we're used to being dealt a horrible hand, I guess.
I also thought it was interesting that it seems that they're Muslim, which is, I guess that makes sense because Islam moved through Africa to Spain at some point. But I double checked, and they are Muslim.
You did? Okay, perfect. Yeah, because I know, like, Allah's the sort of, like, holy figure of Islam, but, like, I thought there's an irony that the show doesn't have any time to address the fact that there is parallel between, like, Kunta Kinte at the end, like, praying to Allah that he's going to be saved, and everyone talking about godliness, but, like, the truth of at least Abrahamic religions is that ostensibly, if we zoom all the way out, and I know some people still don't believe this, we're talking about the same people.
Right. Like,
the gods they're talking about have different names, but they kind of mean the same thing. But yeah, that's not even close to the scope of this show to get into, but yeah, I just thought that was funny.
The other, just like a trivia thing that I found on the IMDb page for this episode. Several of the actors in this were nominated for Emmys, including LeVar Burton. But the only person from Roots to win an acting Emmy was Ed Asner.
The Emmys are bad.
Yep.
And, like, kind of still are. Let's not even.
Yeah, all award things are racist. I mean, when did Green Book won Best Picture? What, like a year ago?
It took him a little bit.
We're not clear of it yet.
Nope. I do want to talk about the second episode and sort of how the story evolves to be more about American history outside of the story of these slaves. And we'll do that after this brief musical break.
No disrespect, but I can't watch no motherfucking more black movies where niggas getting dogged out, 12 years a slave, Roots, Underground. I can't watch none of that shit. Sick of this shit. How the fuck they gonna put Roots on Memorial Day? They gonna just keep beating that shit in our heads of how they did us, huh? I mean, I don't understand America. They just want to just keep showing the abuse that we took hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But guess what? We taking the same abuse. Think about that part. When y'all gonna make a motherfucking series about the success that black folks is having? The only success we have is Roots and 12 Years a Slave and shit like that, huh? Fuck y'all, I ain't watching that shit. And I advise you motherfuckers that's real niggas like myself, fuck them television shows. Let's create our own shit based on today. How we live and how we inspire people today. Black is what's real. Fuck that old shit. Right, Jules?
Welcome back to RootsChatz. The second episode that we watched this week was part 2 of the 1977 miniseries Roots. It was written for TV by William Blinn and Ernest Kinoy, directed by John Erman. It originally aired on January 24th, 1977. Alan, tell the folks what happened in Roots Part 2.
I certainly will. Despite a violent rebellion, the slave ship Lord... what is it again? Ligonier? Ligonier?
Lord Ligonier, yeah.
I should have to remember how to pronounce it, because the words are weird. The slave ship Lord Ligonier completes its voyage in 1767, and Kunta Kinte endures the indignity of an Annapolis slave auction. Fiddler, the slave in charge of Kunta's training, becomes his only friend, but Kunta's plans to escape and be with Fanta eventually put their friendship to the test. Whoa.
Yeah.
Pretty good summary. I think one of the main things I want to talk about with this episode is how it frames America and it frames American complacency and the average American's complacency in the slave trade, sort of separately from the people that were directly employed by the slave trade. Because it's here that we get to see the farm and what it's like in Pennsylvania and what people who have lived through
Virginia.
Is it? I could have sworn it was Pennsylvania. I thought.
Well, they say Spotsylvania County, Virginia.
Virginia. Okay. Yeah, I thought that stuff was really good because that's like we were talking about before. We're now at least into a century into slavery just in America. So
yeah.
These are people who have lived with it, who have had generations grow up with this being completely normal.
Yes. Right.
So the children watching, there's a lot of shots basically of Kunta Kinte throughout this episode, during the auction and afterwards, looking at people and realizing not only that like these people all think this is normal, but like some of these people look like me, and they also have grown up knowing it's normal because some of them probably just grew up here.
Yeah, because you're talking about when he's being auctioned and he sees in the crowd there's like a little boy and a little girl and stuff.
Yeah, that stuff. And then also later when he like meets the family. But yeah, that stuff, that's the first example of like, yeah, there's black people in here who are looking at me with the sort of contempt that
I see.
That everyone else here is looking at me with. It's a lot. I think that's one of the main like sort of arcs in this episode.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple. Maybe we could start on the Lord Ligonier and talk about because we get set up in part 1 to think there's going to be a revolt on the ship.
Oh yeah.
And so we can kind of talk about how that plays out. So this was not uncommon. This was happened quite a lot on ships trafficking people from Africa to the New World through the Middle Passage, that those ships would experience revolts, to the point that Slater is sort of talking with Captain Davies about it at one point and saying like, okay, this is the part of the voyage where they're still strong enough physically to fight us. So we should be making some sort of contingency plan for that happening. And Davies is like, well, surely armed men in good health can restrain chained men in weakened condition.
Yeah.
And Slater's like, yeah, I guess so. Well, whatever. We know all the tricks of the trade, he says. So we'll keep them contained. And Captain Davies is like, I'm sure you do, Mr. Slater. I'm sure you do. So we have this moment where they're on deck for another instance of being taken out of the hold to move around, and there's a bit of chaos because it seems that there's a woman who's running away from presumably someone who was raping her, and she throws herself overboard.
Yeah.
Fanta is there too, and there's this really, really sad interaction between Kunta and Fanta where he goes over to her and he's like, hey, you've got to like stand up. This is not the way that a Mandinka maiden would behave or whatever. And with tears streaming down her face, she says, I'm no longer a Mandinka maiden.
Right. She's realizing before he does that they're going to lose this like fundamental part of them now.
Well, I think what she means by that is that she was raped.
Oh.
So like she's saying she doesn't either like I'm not a maiden anymore, meaning I'm no longer a virgin, or she's just saying I feel that I no longer belong to our society because I was violated by these white men.
Right. Oh,
and
wow.
Kunta doesn't understand because later in the episode it seems like he doesn't know what sex is.
Yeah.
So he doesn't get what she means by that, and he kind of just like backs away, not realizing that he is like essentially abandoning her to that fate or to that, you know, that feeling that she's having because he doesn't understand what she meant.
Right, in the way that even when brought on the same brought on the same ship, they're still separated on, in this case, on like sex lines. The fact that she's being taken ostensibly to be a sex slave, and he's being taken to be a labor slave, and the sort of like the way that that's delineated by the people selling them and not by them is both incredibly dehumanizing and also like isolating. They talk a lot about loneliness and like separation from the people that mattered to you in this episode.
Yeah.
I think also both Kunta Kinte and Davies, between episodes 1 and 2, they really cake on the like it has been months makeup on both of them.
Yeah.
Davies looks completely pale, stark white, huge dark black bags under his eyes, and this is a little weird to say, but Kunta Kinte looked like LeVar Burton does currently. Like they just basically they aged him up.
They
like
aged him up, yeah.
Exactly. Which is what'll happen when you're starved and put out to sea for months, chained to other humans. But yeah, it's kind of like not the best makeup work, but it gets across the point that like, because they play a lot with time in this episode. Like a decent amount of time is passing across this whole episode.
Like
you're not watching
at least several months. Yeah.
Yes, you're not watching a straight like day-to-day narrative. You're watching exactly like months go by that they're just in this, which is kind of hard to get across unless you really like make a point to show them looking different. We also get to see not Davies but the other guy. Who's the other?
Slater.
Slater at this point is just being fully terrible to even his own men. Because one of them, when the woman jumps off, he's like, the reason you let her out was because you were you raped her, and like I told you guys that you were going to get to do that when we like, you know, ensured that the ship was clean and everything. And he yells at them and he hits them, and it's like this guy is no longer like, he kind of like leaves the realm of being a character, and now he's just an awful like evil thing. But that basically cues us up for the uprising to begin. I thought they managed to slip in a little bit of humor in an otherwise very serious, very grim, dark scene, because I guess grimdark's not the word, more just grim, because grimdark more implies like unnecessarily dark, but this is definitely just dark correctly. But the comedy being that when everybody starts striking back because they realize that one of the young men on the ship has the key to their chains around his neck. Really poor planning, by the way.
Yeah, just a dorky, huge ring that can very easily slide off his neck.
On this like 10-year-old goober nerd who's just like, but the fact that the drum boy, because in the last episode when they're all dancing, they're listening to music being played by a white accordion player and a black man playing the drums on the top of the deck. Mm-hmm. The drum guy just hits the accordion player and knocks him out and kills him. Like you know, that plus the like surprisingly upbeat music in this scene really like gets across that you're allowed to feel good for this guys. Like, this is actually people fighting and killing each other in a way that's like, if this works out for us, is great. Or works out for the slaves. It all seems like it's going okay. And then one of the other young kids, again, just like a teenage boy, is manning one of the cannons and has the genius idea, I guess, to turn the cannon on his own ship and shoot a cannon through the revolting slaves. Which you get this like horrible brief shot of it going like passing through the wrestler, who like flies off screen and dies. And basically that wipes out the revolt in an instant. Which is sad, but again, like you were saying, these revolts happened on ships a lot. A lot of them didn't succeed, and we're right back to them arriving in Annapolis right after this. But now the wrestler is gone, and so are a ton of the slaves.
Yeah, it's really the moment where Kunta Kinte is like on his own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't have a senior member anymore, another person who speaks his own language. He's now a character, a completely stranger in a strange land, so to speak.
And that guidance was so important to him, because there's that exchange we didn't talk about in the first episode, but where he basically needs the wrestler's help kind of understanding what is even happening to them. Because it's like, oh, we'll get out and we'll swim to shore. And he's like, no, we've been on this boat for days. That's not happening. And the wrestler teaches him important lessons about like finding solidarity with other people and about sort of picking your moment, because you can see that Kunta Kinte like twitches to start a little bit sooner than the wrestler thinks is like the most opportune moment. He talks to him about like when Kunta Kinte says that he like vomited on himself and he feels ashamed and like less of a man, and the wrestler's like, that's fine, like God sees us and he sees the horrible inhumane conditions we're in, and he understands that you're still strong and you're still a man. And it's like that level of nuance is invaluable for the challenges that Kunta Kinte is going to have to face when he's gone.
Right. He doesn't become the character that he does in episode 2 without the guidance of people like the wrestler and his family and the rest of his community. That's why we spend so much time focusing on that, is so once that's all ripped away from him, we see that he still holds those morals true and close to his heart no matter what. Yeah.
So the revolt eventually is, like you said, the revolt fails. We dock in Annapolis, and Captain Davies meets his sort of contact with the company, Mr. Carrington. Ugh. He's just like a disgustingly foppish British merchant guy.
Who's not even the guy that he was supposed to talk to.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, that guy's busy. He's doing other stuff. I'm the new guy.
Davies is just bleary and sick. He's so ill.
He looks terrible.
He looks awful, yeah. And the line, we both wrote this down. This line is so good.
I got chills.
Where Mr. Carrington's covering his mouth and he's like, I forgot how bad these ships smell. And he and Slater both are like, the stench, as if to like blame the enslaved people for the way that they smell.
Yeah, yeah.
When it's like, if you chain people together in such close proximity for months and months and basically make them defecate all over themselves and puke all over themselves and barely clean it, of course they're going to smell bad. Mm-hmm. But he's sort of acting like, these ships always smell this way.
I don't know why. It's weird.
And then he's like, how do you get used to the smell? And Davies very, very flatly says custom and avarice.
Ugh.
Which is such an incredible line, because he's recognizing avarice is one of the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
He's recognizing that he is deeply entrenched in sin at this point. Even if he was trying to fool himself into thinking that he wasn't, now he knows, like, okay, I have sinned very, very badly in the name of greed.
Of profit, exactly, and greed. Yeah.
He also
the
says
Carrington
this
guy's
line...
just... Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The Carrington guy is great because it's like, we think of this as like a story about America, and we are still pre-American Revolution, so even amongst the American people here, they're still interacting with and acknowledging that like the British are still a threat and still are around and comfortable. So I think I think it was really good that they mentioned, because I know as we get further away from the coast, we're not going to see as much of the British. So it was good that they put him here.
Yeah, all of the white people are, I think, valuable case studies in like the different ways that white people are complicit in systemic oppression. Slater is like on the front lines of like, I'm doing this because I want to, but also I'm going to pretend like it's good for these people when obviously it isn't. Davies is like, I'm going to hold my nose the whole time, but I'm still doing what I'm doing. And then Carrington is like completely detached and just sees this as like business and numbers. Because he basically asks like, how did the voyage go? And Davies is like, well, you know, my men died. I think Slater died in the
yes,
uprising.
he takes a Kentucky throws a knife at him as soon as he sees he's going for the wrestler, and he stops him from going for the wrestler by throwing a knife at his chest, and he falls over. Yeah.
So
and he's like, I don't, whatever, your men, fine, whatever. What about
he's
the
like, yeah,
slaves?
that's a bummer, but how many people in your cargo hold survived? And then he like gives him the manifest, and Carrington's like, ooh, loose pack, huh? Ugh. Oh my God.
Gross.
Disgusting.
And he's like, what's your ratio of survivors? Yeah. And he's like, yeah, about 3/4 survive. And he's like, whoa, nice, dude.
Yeah. Oh
great job.
It's really gross.
Filth.
And then this other the sort of final big moment for Davies is to Carrington, he says, don't you ever think about how we are as imprisoned as those chained in the hold below?
Yeah.
Do you ever think about that? And Carrington's like, yeah, I don't know what you mean. I've never thought about that. I'm going to keep living my life.
I told Magellan recently that I got a work email that was like similarly corny, because it was like, I know we're all dealing with the virus of COVID-19, but I'd like to address today another virus that has permeated society for centuries, and that is the virus of racism.
It's dorky to get that from your boss. I think that's a good sentiment, but a boss sending that is
head of a large department, exactly.
But this is a sentiment that I think that white people maybe don't think about as much as they should when it comes to racial injustice. Like, obviously it would be problematic to say like white people are the real victims of racism, which is not at all what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I do think there's an extent to which like harm is done to the humanity of white people when they cooperate with such an inhumane system, you know? And so Davies is obviously kind of like absolving himself of any agency here by saying that he's imprisoned in this system. You could do something about it. But he is recognizing that like white people do not unilaterally benefit from white supremacy. Obviously they benefit in material terms, but in moral terms, if you believe in such thing as a soul, like his soul is stained by involving himself in this. And so I think to a certain extent you can think about like ending white supremacy in part, not just as like the way white people mostly think about it and the way that I've thought about it before, of like, oh yeah, I'm going to save, like the white savior thing of like, I'm going to save black people from oppression, but also like, you know, white people need to be saved in a sort of spiritual sense as well. And so it's just as important a part of the process to like kind of atone and repair and make reparations and all that, as it is to say like, we did it, we saved you from racism.
Right.
So I thought that was a really interesting line to include there.
Yeah, the role of spirituality again in the show, and the idea of the soul and all that stuff is important to every character, and not just Kunta-Kinte and not just Davies and company.
He's so deeply miserable knowing that he's
stuck in the loop.
Yeah, and Carrington is like, yeah, so you're gonna take some tobacco to England, and then he's like, and what am I gonna take from England? He's like, oh, just some trade goods. And then
That's
you're going
fine.
to go to the Gambian coast again. And
Get slaves.
you'll do it again and again and again. He says, ad infinitum.
And then we die.
Yeah.
He says, what harm can there be in prosperity? And it's like, oh, yay, capitalism has reached the new world. Congratulations.
Right.
We did it. He's like, oh. Like, it's just so strange that Davies doesn't know how this works, that he's like a successful sailor and he hasn't like moved cargo before, because the Golden Triangle is like the key to the success of like the profit of sailors at the time.
Right, the triangular trade.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the fact that I think they use he calls it the Golden Triangle in this.
Oh,
which,
he does.
Yeah, which is weird considering like how many the Golden Triangle is a general term. It refers to like a perfect isosceles triangle. It can also refer to a lot of different things. Basically, like a perfect trio. This is a forced dyad of disgusting, horrible trade. But yeah, he's talking about like it's all good because it's all money at the end for us, which at this point we just need to divorce ourselves. Like I mentioned in our pilot chats that I wanted to see Davies get some sort of comeuppance. And, like, I think that him realizing that he's trapped and he can't escape is the closest thing to that. Like, he's in sort of a Dante's Inferno-esque, like, infinite...
Circle of hell, yeah.
Yes. But, you know, we're not, like, we don't see him after these couple of scenes.
Yeah, it's not that satisfying knowing that his torture is to continue to
make
torture hundreds of people
and
make tons of money for his family.
Meanwhile, Kunta Kinte is tarred in preparation for his auction, and I mean this stuff is all horrible, but we see a scene where this is the one that actually this is like the line that kind of scared me the most, I guess. They're talking about how the different slaves have different like personalities, and one of the men says that they give laudanum to the quiet ones and we give brandy to the loud ones. So we're basically laudanum is it's a drug. It's used as a drug, correct? It's like an herb used as a drug, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure its exact purpose.
But I think the point is that like we can kind of bring them all to a point of control. Like this episode especially is about like making somebody controllable, and how do you do that, and why you can't do that to Kunta Kinte.
Laudanum is a tincture of opium containing approximately 10% powdered opium by weight.
Okay, so yeah, they're drugging them up.
Yeah. It's what does it do?
I think opium in general can have a sort of calming, numbing effect, but it can also like I was just curious because he says laudanum for the I think he says laudanum for the quiet ones.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact descriptions, but yeah, it's like laudanum or brandy or whatever.
Yeah. And then I think it's Kunta Kinte sees is it that he sees Fanta again here? And she has the line about the moon?
Yeah, they talk, and she says she's thinking about her family and about how far away they are. And she says, do you have the moon line?
Well, she's talking... Well, I don't have the whole line. I have the end of it. Because she's saying that is this the same moon that we saw back in the Gambia, back in our village? And he says it's probably the same moon. But I don't really know. And she says here, I would hate to think that my mother and brother can see that moon, but can't see me.
Yeah.
I don't want them to see the same moon because, quote, being close without touching is like eating and not swallowing, which hit me hard in quarantine, honestly. More than the rest of the show is already hitting hard. Just the whole, like, it's not just about us being slaves too. It's like we are being forcefully taken away and never being allowed to go back. None of us know how to use ships. None of us are ever going to be able to get a ship. They won't get here. The odds of us ever seeing them again are infinity to 1. So
yeah,
we're seeing the same moon, but we're never going to be together. And that's sad. And it's really hard. And I think the actress who plays Fanta is wonderful, and I wanted to see more of her. Yeah. But from here we get to
and then just the other thing in that scene is Kunta Kinte is like, we're gonna see them again, don't worry. And she's like, yeah, you're taught to say stuff like that.
Yeah,
like that's the warrior talking. And then she says, since we've been taken, I've learned another lesson. And Kunta Kinte is like, what lesson? And she says, I've learned to stay alive.
Ugh.
Like that's
Oh.
all it's about now. It's
Right.
not about seeing her family again. That's an impossibility. Now it's just about surviving.
And I think that idea of surviving, and it's generational, like we were saying earlier. It's not about this group of people surviving. It's about an entire race surviving, an entire like group of people, because we are introduced here to, at the auction scene, the character of Fiddler, who ends up being very important, and very quickly we see that he's like the type of black slave who has ostensibly learned to adapt and has reached a point in his sort of contract, his servitude to Mr. Reynolds, where he's able to eat at the kitchen with them. He eats full meals with them. They speak nicely to him. He's fluent in English. He's able to dress like them. To him, he is comfortable. He's lived a life that he feels like he's earned a sort of freedom.
Yeah.
So his relationship to Kunta Kinte becomes realizing that that's not freedom in any way. But first we see the auction of Fanta, which I like could not write anything about this because we're fully in like, men, feel free to come up and grope this woman and tell me what you think, if she has any like blemishes on her. And she's finally sold to a man who says just the most, I mean, ghoulish line here when
someone is like, the auctioneer maybe is like, it's my pleasure or something. Or no, he says it's my pleasure for buying her.
he says, "My pleasure, sir." He's like, "Congratulations on your new slave." And he says, "My pleasure, sir. And I'm certain she will be my pleasure, sir." Which, great and good. Bad.
It speaks to the scene we were talking about earlier with her on the deck, where there's just a whole another world of cruelty that's brought upon women who are enslaved,
Right.
and that men who are enslaved don't necessarily experience.
Yeah, in different ways, exactly.
Yeah.
And we're getting this sort of like broad spectrum of slavery, the different types of people. As Kunta Kinte is brought up to the auction, we get a first-person shot from him seeing the different people, like we said earlier, older women who are ogling him with a sort of like the sexual interest of like a predator to its prey. Like they're essentially like licking their lips at this man. Literal children that can't make eye contact with him because they don't understand what they're looking at. Other black men who are looking at him.
Well, and I think the children are not making eye contact because they're bored. Because
Right,
it's
they
like,
just see
my
this.
parents brought me to another boring auction. Like they are totally desensitized to what's happening in front of them.
Yeah, it's Reynolds' kids later being like, "Why didn't you get me more books or whatever?"
Yeah, right.
There's a human here, guys. There's a whole human.
Yeah.
And it's the way that racism can be sort of like trained. You can be trained into as well because
You learn it. If you're a kid who's brought to something like this when you're 10, you are going to think that it's okay. You are going to be like, that's at least, I mean, that doesn't excuse it because just the basic logic of humanity is like, you shouldn't sell people or enslave people, but racism is learned in moments like this.
And there are definitely people too in the audience who know that this is bad and are too afraid or are also slaves themselves. Literally the last shot before we get to the auctioneer is just an indigenous man who's just standing in the background, completely stone-faced, looking Kunta Kinte in the eye, like, "Yep, I know, but I'm not doing anything. I can't do anything. I won't do anything."
Right.
And it must be, this is where we also remember that, like, all these people speaking English, and when we were in the Gambia, we saw all of the people there speaking to what we understand as English, though they're not speaking the same language. And so when the auctioneer is doing the, like, the bidding, Kunta Kinte is just hearing nonsense. He's just hearing what we already think is, like, the classic, like, auctioneer going,
Thing.
and he's just hearing that as even like less of words. It's like, it must be so scary.
Yeah.
And just all the power dynamics in this auction scene are horrifying, because of the lack of understanding and the lack of like realization that like they are purchasing you with money to own you. And this guy's writing on paper that you belong to that guy now. That's what's happening to you. So he is purchased by Mr. Reynolds, and told that he's going to be given a new name. They try to decide. He says, like, is there a a Matthew or whatever? And he's like, no, Matthew's the cook or whatever. And he's like, okay, he is Toby. We've decided that Kunta Kinte's name is now not his name, which was extremely common. It's just the way that he's like picking a name out of a hat is screwed up too.
Yeah.
That he's like, it's a cool name. I think that's going to be the name that we identify him as, and will attack him for not using.
Yeah, I mean, it's the level of casualness. Like when I got my foster cat recently, and the foster people said her name was Marcia, and I didn't feel like calling her Marcia, so I'm calling her something else. You know? It's like that level of complete disregard for
agency,
Kunta Kinte's humanity and agency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that stuff is very, again, I think, like 101 racism. I think that this episode tries to like really dig into how complex the systemic racism in the States has become, because when he's brought back to Virginia, like you were saying, Mr. Reynolds assigns the fiddler to basically, he says, you have 6 months until my birthday. I want you to bring him back to the farm on my birthday, trained. I want you to tame him and teach him the Queen's English or the King's English.
Yeah.
And at first I thought he meant like, hey, here's your homework assignment. Like, go do it while you're doing other things. But no, he literally is like, I'm going to leave you guys here and you're going to come back in 6 months. Or I'm going to come down. Or like,
that's not what happens.
Okay.
They like break down the wagon, the horse's shoe breaks or something.
Okay.
So Fiddler has to reshoe the horse to get them to get them to the plantation. Reynolds says all that stuff about like, yeah, you're gonna have to make Kunta Kinte act like an obedient enslaved person. And then he's like, all right, I'll see you back at the plantation. So he doesn't leave them for like the extent of that time. Okay. He leaves them for like an hour or something, because Fiddler still has to fix the horseshoe and take the wagon back to the plantation.
That explains, because I was confused how quickly they then went back to the plantation, and I was like, wait, how long was that? But that makes more sense.
It was just like an hour or two or something, because then they arrive there together,
and we get to meet the rest of Reynolds' family, his daughters and his wife, who are like, why didn't you bring books and toys and stuff? That's what we wanted, Dad. All you brought was this human.
Right. And in that moment, there are actually a couple moments where this episode references events that people are probably more familiar with in a way that I find interesting. The moment where earlier Carrington is talking to the printer guy, and he's like, hey, can you print up an advertisement for this auction? And the guy is like,
all right, slaves in all caps.
I'll put slaves in big type, sir. Catches the eye, which is, yeah. And then Carrington's like, okay, cool. And can you print me some handbills for this? And the guy's like, well, I'd like to, but there are all these other things that people want me to print. Like Patrick Henry gave this speech recently, and he's talking about the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech.
Oh, catch.
And like, oh, there's some stuff from Boston about the Townsend Acts that are even worse than the Stamp Act. And the dude's like, I don't give a fuck about those things. Print my advertisement for this auction. I will pay you to do it. And so I thought that was a really cool moment of illustrating the
rest
disregard
of like
for this what we would consider the mainstream narrative of American history, of like liberty and freedom and fighting against tyranny.
Exactly.
And the dude's like, whatever. That'll pass. Let me sell my people, please.
Yeah.
And then the other moment here when Reynolds comes home and he's like, sorry girls, I wasn't able to get you special stuff because like things are being taxed and boycotted. Some stupid stuff that's going on right now. I'm sorry, but I smuggled it for you anyway. So here you go. Yeah.
Oh, his family. That's so much.
Yeah.
Especially the wife. But we get there.
Wow.
The other major character we're introduced to here is Mr. Ames, who I foolishly thought early on was going to be a little bit more interesting and nuanced. And I do think that he's a little bit more complex than like...
I think he's pragmatic in a way that's similar to Slater.
Exactly. I was going to compare him to Slater, yeah.
Yeah.
It sort of feels like there are roles that are shifted along to this episode from episode 1. Like, in a way, Fiddler is a bit of a Davies in that he's like, I'm in a broken system, but I can't, like, understand what getting out of it looks like. But by the end, I think he actually has a more redemptive arc than Davies does, obviously. Or he has a redemptive arc. Mm-hmm. So he's threatening Fiddler, and later on he's telling Reynolds this whole theory that, like, maybe does not believe that slaves are inherently born inferior. And they have lots of conversations both in and out around the house and around the plantation about, like, can we teach them to be quote unquote good like us, or are they entirely
I thought this whole scene was really interesting, where it's Ames and Reynolds and his wife, and it's like the piano teacher or something. I don't know who that guy was. But yeah, Ames definitely has this very pragmatic view of, like, slavery and racial difference is a construct, you guys. Yeah. We construct it out of fear. That's how it works.
We knew that.
And the reason that he has that point of view is he talks about how he was an indentured servant for 7 years, which was a common practice for the first, few decades or century or whatever of plantation agriculture in the colonies, but actually was discontinued as a practice because, in part, it presented the danger of there being solidarity between white indentured servants and black enslaved people. And so completely racializing slavery was an important part of keeping that from happening. But you can sort of see the seeds in Ames of somebody who, if he were not, the fact that he's white means that he could end his servitude and rise to a certain position in the hierarchy where he has power. And so to him, it's like, okay, cool. That's how it's going to work. But he has, like you're saying, this very straightforward view of, like, we're not born different. White people are not born physically superior to black people. That's not how it works. We make things this way. But then the other thing that's interesting in that conversation is the talk about, like, well, what about intellectual difference?
That's where the wife comes in and she's like, can we read them books?
Yeah, she's like, so I know that they're less intelligent.
We all know that. That's just known. I'm not stupid.
Like, yeah. We, of course. And then she says, so if they're, like, less capable of understanding like major concepts or whatever, why not teach them to read and write? Which is, it's a good question if you are working from those prejudices of, like, if we're saying that they're mentally inferior, then what danger does teaching them to read pose? And you can see that Reynolds knows in his heart of hearts that it's all bullshit.
Yeah. Teaching them means that they'll know that they can be free also, or knows that they will free themselves.
And his buddy does some real logical gymnastics to be like, well, but they're happy in their ignorance, and if we taught them, they would just realize that they're enslaved, and it would make them sad. So we shouldn't do that.
Ignorance is bliss, you guys.
Yeah, I think the miniseries is just doing a really good job of laying bare the insidious ways that white people justified the practice of slavery,
and often still do, right? Or not to say that the average person today is saying, like, they deserved it, obviously, but a lot of people, like you were saying earlier, saying, like, well, they were doing it to each other in Africa, or, like, the American economy wouldn't be what it is today if it weren't for slavery in the 1700s. Like,
Yeah, or like I've seen excerpts from textbooks in Texas or something that are like, some masters were nice to their enslaved people.
yeah,
And sure, they like physical abuse happened from time to time, but it was rare. Like that's stuff that has been put in textbooks within the last 10 years.
exactly.
Yeah, so there is still an effort to want to kind of absolve or forget about the way that slavery really was. And what was I going to say?
Well, I don't want to, you can feel free to jump in at any
go
point.
ahead.
But I think that's exactly why it's really important that the fiddler kind of takes on the role of like our empath, the person that we have the most pathos for in this episode, because obviously we're still focusing on Kunta Kinte and him trying to be free, but like the fiddler is somebody who has grown up presumably almost his entire life as a slave and has so fully internalized that this is the only way that he can live, that it takes somebody newly coming to him and having this sort of rebellious spirit within him for him to realize, fuck, like they're lying to me.
I remembered what I was going to say, by the way.
What were you going to say?
If you're viewing this in the 70s, these conversations in the previous scene that the white people are having about like, they were blissful in their ignorance and all that stuff. Those are like similar to depictions of slavery in other popular media prior to Roots. So like Gone with the Wind or something depicts a pretty rosy understanding, or Birth of a Nation. They depict a pretty rosy understanding of like the old plantation South back in the good old days when everybody was in their proper place and everybody was happy about it and that sort of thing. So in a way, you can sort of read that scene not just as a critique of thinking in the 1760s, but a critique of thinking in like the 1960s, you know? It's really within the span of a single person's lifetime. If you're someone when did Gone with the Wind come out? In like the 30s, right?
I don't know why my brain wants to say 47. Hold on.
39.
39.
So if you're watching Roots in 77, it's conceivable that if you're like an adult and you have kids, that like maybe you saw Gone with the Wind in theaters or you have seen it before or something.
Right, it played on TV a lot.
Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of bring in that idea, but we can return to talking about the fiddler. So I found the fiddler to be kind of a puzzling character because ostensibly, like you were saying, he sort of has this limited understanding or perspective, or you could even say like a limited range of hope about what's possible. And so to him, an ideal life within the scope of what he thinks can happen is I get to eat my dinner in the big house and get new clothes and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's presented that way. And I think I was reading this article that I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, but this article from BuzzFeed News, actually, called The Django Problem and the Tangled History of Roots. And something it talks about is actually two kind of oversimplifications that Roots carries out. The first is that Alex Haley portrayed 1769 Juffure, where Kunta Kinte's from, as this like tiny village that's sort of like an Eden almost, when in actuality it was a city of thousands of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that I figured.
And then the other thing that I thought was interesting is that Kunta Kinte is portrayed among the African Americans, the people who are born into slavery, as the only person who's conscious of his like African heritage and identity. And it's sort of like, oh, all these other people have forgotten. He even kind of says to himself, they've forgotten their names. They've forgotten who they are. I'm not going to become like them. Mm-hmm. And there's this quote in the article where this historian Eric Foner says, when Kunta Kinte shows up in the 1760s in Virginia, nobody else has any sense of Africa on his plantation. That's ridiculous, said Foner. The people who he would have encountered were Africans. The vast majority of the slaves were brought in between 1730 and 1770. These were not people who had lost their African names, heritage, and everything.
So it's not like they were generations away from it.
Yeah, some of them might have been.
Yeah.
But he's sort of depicted as like the only person who was born in Africa on this plantation, which is not true. So it's sort of an oversimplification, the contrast between Fiddler and Kunta Kinte. But Fiddler kind of has a different idea of like what resistance looks like that I think it's actually a version that Kunta Kinte could learn from. I don't know what's best. I don't think it's my place to say what's best, but Fiddler is not like, he resists in his own way.
Yes.
He steals food from the table, like he gives bread to the kids.
Mm-hmm. Or like sugar or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. He makes fun of Reynolds in a couple funny moments. Like when they're he's talking with the women who are like, I think washing clothes or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of them says that pretty soon Reynolds, if he keeps eating, his belly's going to get so big he won't be able to see his penis anymore. And Fiddler makes a joke basically that like nobody would buy him just by looking at his penis because it's like not good or something.
Right.
And then there's another moment where he's talking to Kunta Kinte and he's like, I'm having a hard enough time teaching you the difference between manure and master. And, maybe there isn't much of a difference, which is good. And then,
I mean, even little moments like when Ames tells him to do stuff and says, hurry up. And he's like, okay, yes, sir. Right away, sir. And then like goes at a glacial pace. Like he's not going to get stopped. He knows his limits. That
was one of the principal ways that enslaved people would resist is they would just work slowly.
Yeah.
And then my favorite joke is when Kunta Kinte is recaptured, and we'll talk about that. And he goes into the house and he says to to Mrs. Reynolds, like, "Oh, can I see Mr. Reynolds? Can I see your husband?"
Yeah. Yep.
And she says, "Oh, he's going over the scripture." And and Fiddler's like, "The man's a Christian saint.
Christian saint he is.
But can I please talk to him?"
She says, "Don't overstay your welcome," which is fun because the whole narrative that he's like, "They like me," is like immediately like, "No, they don't, dude." you know they don't.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's hard to get a read on Fiddler. Like, to what extent is he being naive versus is he being like realistic and pretty savvy? I think it's a tricky question.
Right. It's important, though, that the show doesn't cast a like big swath of judgment on him.
Yeah.
Because when he's trying to teach Kunta Kinte English and he's saying, like, point to this is carriage, say carriage, say my name is Fiddler, and he knows that, like, you're not gonna have the like the language I understand that your language is it's gonna take a while for you to adjust to this, but try because they're going to hurt me. And I also want to help you, and I want you to be able to have the opportunities that I have. And that's sort of like understanding that, like, hey, we're coming from different parts of the same place. We share a heritage, and we're both slaves here. I'm not trying to hurt you, and I'm never going to hurt you, but I also need, like, my life depends on you falling in line. So, it's the same thing like when we talked in the pilot chats about this, like, my sort of surprise, and clearly the intended viewer's surprise, that a lot of slaves or enslaved people were taken in by fellow African men. Is like, yeah, you're all brought into the same sort of system and forced to bring each other into it.
Yeah, and part of the cruelty that we see here is the sort of white masters are delegating their cruelty to enslaved people. So like Ames is surprised that Mr. Reynolds, that John, let's call him John. That's his first name, right?
Which one?
Reynolds.
Yes, I believe. Yeah, John Reynolds.
Okay.
Yep.
Ames is surprised that John is insisting that Fiddler be the one who quote unquote breaks Kunta Kinte, and Ames is like, there's a science to it, the way that you would break an animal. Like, you can't just have this guy do it. But the reason that John Reynolds is so insistent on Fiddler doing it is in part because it makes Fiddler complicit in the cruelty of slavery, and makes him only more closely tied to his desires as the plantation owner. And then what I was kind of shocked by is the scene when Kunta Kinte has been captured and he's being whipped in front of everybody, and made to answer to the name Toby, is that it's not Ames that is whipping him.
No.
It's one of the other enslaved people who's holding the whip and doing it. Which again is about making the enslaved people complicit in the enslavement and the cruelty towards one another, further installing this sort of reign of fear and hopelessness and all those things.
Yeah.
It's a very calculated choice.
Exactly. All of the enslaved people are going to watch, and also one of them is going to do the whipping. Like, it's all taking it out of my hands. They did it to each other, kind of thing. That's the sort of narrative that they're peddling. There is also some great moments. I mean, a lot of this is mostly just Fiddler and Kunta Kinte talking back and forth, and Kunta Kinte learning English, and all of that. But I think my favorite scene between the two of them is after Kunta Kinte does the big thing. He breaks his chains, meaning that he can no longer be under live with Mr. Reynolds and live in that farm anymore. It's because now that we know that he's going to break it, who's to say he isn't going to do it again? We've already considered, like, the second those things have broken, he's an escaped slave. And he knows that, and he says to Fiddler, chains ain't right for us. He uses a different word that I'm not going to use, but he says chains are not right for us. And instead of Fiddler being like, oh damn, you're right, like I should break free too, he says, you sure are a mighty child. You are so young to still think that we're able to break those and that's okay. And he has this they have this very tender moment where Kunta Kinte lays his head against Fiddler's chest, which almost brought a tear to my eye, because it's like, you're not going to come with me. He asks him, like, can you come with me? And he's like, I'm too old. It's too cold. He says,
multiple times too.
Yeah.
Earlier when they're outside, Kunta Kinte's like, Fiddler, run away with me. And Fiddler's basically like, where? There's nowhere for us to go.
The second we get out, I mean, even like when Reynolds leaves them at the beginning for the hour or whatever, he's like, can you give me papers to say that I'm working with you? Because otherwise everyone is going to attack us thinking that we're two escaped slaves. There's no position once we're out of here that we are safe at all.
Yeah.
But also,
it makes you wonder if Fiddler has tried to run before.
It's likely.
Maybe that's where this is coming from.
Or he's thought seriously about it and made the plan before, and now he just hasn't. He's never been able to commit to it or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he tells Mr. Reynolds in that scene later, and so we get to Kunta Kinte escaping with his cool jacket. He's out. It's winter now. We really have been here for months and months and months. He sees snow and gets excited, and then the aforementioned dogs that they talk about. He says, even if you get out there, even if I came with you, it'd be less than 2 miles before the dogs got to us. Kind of dropping the hint that it's not just that we're gonna get attacked by people, but their animals are gonna get at us. So Kunta Kinte is attacked by dogs, and also Mr. Ames comes and has his slave named James whip him while all the other slaves watch, and he does the whole say your name, which I feel is a thing I've seen in multiple pieces of media depicting slavery in America, at least, is the say your new name. And he does the thing, the
well, I wonder if that's a reference to this, maybe, or if that's just a thing.
Yeah, where that originates from, or what's the pull point. He does eventually cave as he has to because he would literally just die from being whipped to death. And the beautiful moment here is we wrap on the fiddler kind of picking up Kunta Kinte on the ground, and he doesn't refer to him as Toby, even though Kunta Kinte has like acquiesced and said, "I'm Toby." He says, "There's going to be another day, Kunta Kinte," and kind of holds him in his arms and is like, "You're not done here yet. Your story is not over. You're still who you are." Beautiful.
It's really beautiful to see in the moment that Kunta Kinte gives up hope. Fiddler
Finds it.
For the first time in a long time. It's really moving.
And it's another one of those, like, this is, I think, ultimately why this episode I was like, is I don't necessarily want to come to Roots to feel good about slavery. I don't want to be like...
Right. It's tough, yeah.
You know? And as a show creator, it must be extremely difficult to tell this story without ending episodes on, like, positive moments like that. Because the first one ends on, like, and we're going to revolt, and it's going to go great. And then it doesn't. And this one is like, and your story is going to be told. And, I mean, that part's true. It is. But...
It really makes you feel like all of this is barreling towards... the finale is going to be like the first of the ancestral line to be free, and that's going to be the end, and we're all going to be like, wow, they did it, you know.
Right.
I'm worried about that being the takeaway from Roots.
Well, the very, very little I know about it seems like at least the next section is going to be a little bit more complicated than that, because the next time we come back to Kunta Kinte, he's going to be a fully grown adult, no longer played by LeVar Burton, which is so fascinating. That, like, we talked about this in our pilot chats, but when people talk about Roots, they're talking about these first two episodes. Like, it's very uncommon for people to talk about the story after young Kunta Kinte. At least from my understanding, it's always like, oh, that was the thing that LeVar Burton was in, like, where he was a slave and he broke free, and like that's the whole story, right? And now that we've watched, two.
I mean, his performance is just so stunning that it really.
Yeah, this made his career.
Why. Yeah.
It's really fantastic, but like I said, the next time we see him, it'll be John Amos playing adult Kunta Kinte, who's in like his 30s or 40s at that point. The version of this that I have had a preview, which is really charming, but I tried not to watch all of it because it kind of just gets into here's everything that happens next episode. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like an interesting one. I almost said it sounds like a fun one, and then I literally bit my tongue. So no, but yeah. I'm engaged. I'm still really curious, even when the story goes beyond this one person. Like, what's the next thing that they want to communicate to us?
I actually really liked the Fiddler Kunta Kinte relationship.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I do think that this. I think that this episode hides the cruelty of slavery pretty significantly.
Mm-hmm.
It shows us certain things. At first, I thought that they weren't even going to show us Kunta being whipped at the end, because the first scream you hear is off screen, which, I don't know if we've dropped in this audio yet, but before we started recording, watched like an Instagram video that Snoop Dogg posted.
Yeah, I think my intent was to drop that in between before we intro to the second segment. But some people have heard it. But yeah, you can describe it.
It's him talking about the 2016 miniseries and basically saying, like, why is it that Black people need to be subjected to seeing this cruelty on screen over and over again? Like, why are those the Black stories that are told in media disproportionately? And I empathize with that. Like, I don't know that I have a good response to it, because he basically says, like, don't watch the Roots remake. And I think it's something we have to reckon with as a TV podcast of, like, how do we make sure that as we go forward and do more shows, this isn't like the only show we do with Black characters in it.
Yeah.
But it's a tough moment, like in this episode or in something like this, where it's like, well, you can sort of imply that all of these horrible things are going on off screen. Like what happens to Kunta, which we do see, actually. I thought we weren't going to, but we do see it.
Yeah, the whipping is shown.
But then there's also the young girl who he mistakes for Fanta, who I think her name is Aurelia.
I believe that's correct.
She's brought by ostensibly by her mother to Ames's house to be raped.
Mm-hmm.
And her mother's like, well, don't you wanted that new sweater or whatever. This is how you get it. And that happens off screen.
Right. That
as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's one thing to be like, showing those things is traumatizing, but also you don't want to do a sort of out of sight, out of mind kind of thing with this cruelty either. And so I don't have a good answer for like, what should you show? How should you show it? Is showing it really in service of something, or is it just sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like snuff film level of like,
The gratuity of it.
Yeah, we're just showing cruelty because people want to watch cruelty happen or something.
Yeah, and it was a challenge when even deciding to cover the show. Is like, we know that this is a show that features graphic depiction of violence against slaves, both physical and sexual and mental and everything. What's the value in that, as opposed to seeing stories of Black success, which thankfully we are approaching seeing more and more of those today in television, with like Black sitcoms and Black writers getting main roles on television shows and films.
More Black showrunners,
which we're still like, we're a couple steps forward, but we can still do a ton of work. And I think that my only response to like that Snoop Dogg thing is like, that there's room for both. Unfortunately, as he's saying, like, especially around the time of 2016, it feels like all you're seeing is that. It feels like there's just vastly more stories of Black suffering and Black pain than there are of success, which kind of paints this picture as as a white American audience of like, thank goodness that's not me anymore. That's so horrible. It's hard. I don't have to reckon with that because it's not me anymore. Right. Like, it's more valuable to show that this violence is happening today, arguably.
Yeah.
Which is why I think it's like we've been trying throughout this episode to like talk about how a lot of the types of the forms of that racism takes in this series are contemporary.
Yep.
Be they physically violent or whatever have you. And often very, very systemic and deeply rooted in this stuff that's been going on since the 1700s. So
yeah, the license that someone like Ames feels he has to physically abuse and assault Kunta Kinte is the same kind of license you see a police officer feeling when they're carrying out an act of brutality, like what we saw happen to George Floyd.
Yep.
Those things are not that different.
You colored it differently and put a uniform on it, basically.
Right.
And paid it a living salary.
Yeah.
So it's one of the challenges of covering a show like this, but I think as a work, again, like we said at the top, it's valuable to at least acknowledge that these stories exist and why they're important, and also wish for and work towards and support artists who are creating more positive depictions of Black history.
Yeah.
Hell, read a Maya Angelou poem.
Sure. Yeah, she was in the show. You might as well.
Yeah. There's your plug, if you will. But before we actually do our formal plugs, I want to talk to you, Magellan, or ask you rather, what's going on next time on RootsChatz? What are we watching?
Well, as we talked about at the beginning, we're going by the home video release episodes of this. If for whatever reason you have access to the original run. So we're watching parts 3 and 4 of the home video release, which are each an hour and a half. Part 3 extends from 1776 to 1790. So it's parts 3 and 4 of the original run. And then part 4 extends from 1806 to 1824. And it covers part 5 and the first half of part 6 of the original run. And I have some descriptions for you here.
Please. Describe.
I will. Also, by the way, something else in that article, just want to say, as we always should, a fuck you to Ronald Reagan, because
big time.
When this miniseries came out, he said that it was destructive, and he said that it had an anti-white bias. So, in
Alright,
case you were wondering if people have always been on their bullshit, they have always been on
Fuck
their
Ronald
bullshit.
Reagan.
All right, episodes 3 and 4. First, part 3. In 1776, a nation fights for freedom, but not for all. Kunta Kinte escapes again and is crippled by slave catchers. He marries, gains a daughter, and loses his longtime friend Fiddler. Well, sorry.
Oh,
Spoilers.
whoops. Shoot.
Another chance for escape arises, but Kunta sacrifices it to care for his wife and the newborn he names Kizzy, an African word for stay put.
Ooh.
That's pretty interesting, right?
Yeah, and then presumably we follow Kizzy from there.
Yes, I believe so. Then part 4. At age 16, Kizzy is... Okay, there's
Damn.
some spoilers here. Sorry.
I'm going to take my headphones out.
Okay, go for it.
Go for it, baby.
At age 16, Kizzy is sold and bears her new master's son, who grows up to become fun-loving Chicken George. Yearning to see her parents, Kizzy is comforted by Samuel Bennett, but they are ill-matched. When she returns to her birthplace, Kizzy learns of her parents' fates. Okay.
Back.
Okay, good. You timed it perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I could hear the vague sounds of you talking.
These episode descriptions on Amazon are just full-on
Spoiler
summaries of what happens.
That's unfortunate.
Beat for beat, yeah. Anyway, so that's what's coming up next week on RootsChatz.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. Let's take it to the plug zone. As a podcast, as a free podcast, it's always essential that we remind people that they can support us and support artists creating things. So if you like what you heard today and you have a question or comment, you can send us something over to our email address, which is chatspod@gmail.com. That's chatspod@gmail.com. We also have a Twitter @chatspod where we post info about the show and we accept comments and feedback there as well. We have a wonderful community-run subreddit over at reddit.com/r/chatspod where we're listening to old chat seasons. If this is your first chat season, welcome. They're not always this serious. We have done some sillier fare, but we're covering Roots right now, and we've covered a lot of stuff in the past. We're coming up on 5 years of chat, so it's pretty buck wild to think about that.
Yeah.
We do encourage you, if you like the show, to rate us on Apple Podcasts, a star rating, write a review if you can. And if you're able to financially support us, we would really appreciate that. We have a Patreon over at patreon.com/chatspod where we have bonus content where that's just $3 a month. You get all of our bonus content, and we have a big backlog where you can get 100% of for just $5 a month. And we have bonus tiers there. Even at $1, you get Magellan's solo podcast where he watches the X-Files. We've got movie commentaries in there. We've got hangout chats. We've got shows, things where we pilot different series. We just put out our pilot chats just yesterday for John Adams and last week for John Adams as well as Roots, because we're going to be covering the 2008 John Adams series after we finish talking about Roots. So yeah, there's a lot over there, but of course plenty of other places for you to put your money if you're not here to support chats besides listening to us, which we do appreciate. I usually like to put the Black Lives Matter card website that has all the different donation links in episode description. So I'll be doing that just to remind people that there are artists out there today who need your help, and people out there who need your help, both financially and through your words and your petitions and everything. So,
and also if finances are tight and you only have a certain amount of money that you can assign to whatever places, if you make a donation to Black Lives Matter or to Black artists or to something like the Equal Justice Initiative or the NAACP or whatever, and you show us a receipt, you don't have to show us how much you donated, the money amount, but if you just show us that receipt, we'll get you a link to our Patreon stuff for doing that. So that's something you could do as well. If you only have a certain amount of money that you can put somewhere, we'd rather that you gave it to a cause like that than to us.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. And lastly, in lieu of a regular personal plug segment, Magellan and I like to do what we call chatsums, where we recommend you something just for your own edification, be it culture, media, activities, whatever. And I want to start, if you don't mind, Magellan, with my chatsum.
Go for it.
So I'm trying, especially in this season of chats, to focus on different chatsums about different countries around the world and stories that portray those cultures in a way that the rest of the world doesn't really think of. So, how Roots is about an American family, and it's actually a Black American family, and it's about slavery. It's not about, a revolution and the Hamilton story of and then a bunch of guys got together and made the world better. It's actually a kind of part of history that we don't talk about. My first chatsum under that sort of category is a film that I watched just last night, which was July 4th, to kind of date us here a bit. I watched with some friends The Hunt for the Wilder People, which is a recent film from director Taika Waititi, which is about a young boy who is brought to a foster family in New Zealand, which is where Waititi and most of the cast is from. And he is his foster father is played by Sam Neill, who I didn't know until watching this film is actually from New Zealand. So his accent in Jurassic Park is actually he's not an American, which is cool. Basically, Hunt for the Wilder People, without getting too deep into spoilers, ends up being about these two on the run from the rest of the country who are looking for them because they suspect that they might have broken the law and committed manslaughter and done all this stuff. And it's about how a society can't trust its own people. And while also it sounds pretty grim, is a very funny, very charming, lovable film that's really warm. And, it's kind of like a nice ad for New Zealand. They have this thing at the end of the credits that's paid for by the New Zealand Film Society. And it's man, this country is beautiful and we just don't hear about this stuff. I started reading about the foster programs in New Zealand. And I was man, this is some long-standing history that I've literally never thought about. So for your own edification and for your enjoyment, for comedic enjoyment, I suggest that you check out the film Hunt for the Wilder People.
Nice.
What about you, Magellan?
Well, I've got, let's see, I've got two recommendations here. The first is something that I'm actually haven't fully listened to yet, but I'm excited to dig into, which is a history podcast called Black History Year, which is instead of Black History Month, right? It's Black History Year. And it's podcast episodes about just African American history, different sort of episodes of that, deconstructing white focused narratives that maybe people learned in school, or just telling stories that maybe you didn't ever know happened. So I'd recommend that, Black History Year. And then I have a movie recommendation as well. I really, really love the films of Federico Fellini, and I've not seen very many of them, but I finally crossed off my movie bucket list La Strada, which is one of his earlier films. And it's basically the story of a woman who is ostensibly purchased by a traveling circus strongman to be his assistant and his wife. And then she sort of gets involved in that kind of carnival world. But there's a loneliness and a desolation to it and a quiet beauty. And it's just a really fantastic film. And I recommend La Strada.
Fellini's La Strada.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, thank you, Magellan, as always, for being the rock to my hard place. And thank you, dear listener, for listening to this episode of RootsChatz. Peace.